Sorry, that's always kind of an alarming sound. Okay, hi folks. Afternoon. Thanks everyone for joining us. That was a real, if you'll excuse the pun, a flood of folks coming over from the Teams meeting. I think some of you got stuck in. So thanks so much for joining. And it's great to see so many folks on this call and see good uptake on the webinar today. As you know, our presentation today is aimed at qualified professionals who may be involved in development applications and planning applications in flood hazard areas within the Comox Valley Regional District, specifically in the electoral areas. I believe many of you joining us have direct experience with planning applications in our region. I'm Monica. I'm a planner one in the long range planning department here at the CVRD, and I was a co-lead on this project. So I'm going to provide you with an overview of the new bylaw and its implications. And following my presentation, we have Eric from KWL who will be presenting briefly on the mapping, which underlies this whole thing. So I'm joined today also by some other CVRD colleagues in our development planning department, as well as John, our manager of building services, and Alana is here, our GM. So there may be some familiar faces to you on this call, even if I am new. So as we proceed, I'd like to ask you to hold your questions to the end. We're going to have a bit of a Q&A. And if you are worried at all about forgetting your question, please feel free to pop it into the chat. One of our great summer students, Tammy, is going to monitor that chat for us, and she can read them out at the end. Also, as you've probably heard, I just want to remind you this webinar is getting filmed. The hope is to be able to share this with other qualified professionals who are not able to attend. So yeah, it is being filmed. So, you know, best behavior. So with that housekeeping out of the way, I'm going to get right into it. So earlier this year, the CVRD adopted Flood Hazard Area Land Use Management Bylaw number 890, and this replaces, the former Floodplain Management Bylaw number 600, which some of you might have been familiar with. This bylaw, number 890, regulates the siting and construction of buildings and structures in lands designated as floodplain and applies to electoral areas A, excluding Denman and Hornby Island, B and C, so all across our electoral areas. The bylaw includes the floodplain regulations, of course, and the designated floodplain mapping, which is shown in the schedules of the bylaw. And this carries the 2021 mapping into bylaw. It also shows for not only the coast, it shows mapping for the Courtney, Puntledge, and Solom rivers and the Oyster River. So the purpose of today's session really is to explain why the bylaw was updated, how it differs from the previous floodplain bylaw, what are the requirements around developing in these areas, and what are the exemptions for some of these requirements. And also, we want to focus on what should be included to ensure complete and consistent qualified professional reports created in support of this type of work. So the CVRD's authority for this bylaw comes from Section 524 of the Local Government Act. Section 524 enables the local government to designate land as floodplain and to specify flood levels and setbacks from watercourses needed to elevate the buildings above the applicable flood level. It also notes local governments must consider the provincial guidelines when making such bylaw. And that's the other topic there on the screen in front of you, which is put out by the province, the Flood Hazard Land Use Management Guidelines. And I'll refer to those mostly as provincial guidelines after this. So Section 524 of the LGA also provides the basis for exemptions. A local government may grant an exemption from a floodplain specification if it receives a qualified professional report confirming that the land may be safely used for its intended use. And the exemption may require terms and conditions of the local government considers necessary and advisable, including requiring a covenant like a Section 219. So for qualified professionals, the folks on this call, this really then is a very important role in this process. Your work forms often the technical basis for the CVRD to consider whether an exemption is supportable. And the QP reports do more than describe flood hazards. They really directly address whether the land may be used safely for its intended use and under what conditions. So the previous bylaw, number 600, which again, many of you might recall, was adopted in 2020. It aligned with the 2018 updates to the provincial floodplain guidelines, and those updates had incorporated sea level rise into the determination of coastal building setbacks and flood construction levels. However, bylaw 600 at that time was considered kind of an interim measure with the idea that it would be revisited once the CBRD had completed coastal floodplain mapping. So coastal flood mapping was completed by Kerwood-Lydell 2021 for the entire region. And this was done with funding support from the National Disaster Mitigation Program. The mapping identifies where and how deep water may be during a flood event. I won't get into too much detail here, so I don't want to do any spoilers for Eric's presentation coming up, but it essentially says how this may change with sea level rise and the floodplain setbacks and flood construction levels that guide where and how high building structures and infrastructures should be constructed to mitigate flood damage. Bylaw number 890 was prepared and adopted earlier this year to incorporate that updated mapping into regulation, as well as looking to kind of modernize some of the CBRD's approach and provide more clarity for applicants, qualified professionals, staff, and decision makers. So we began that process with a bit of an issue identification, and that looked at feedback from staff and also from QPs over the years, really looking and diving into common concerns or complaints about bylaw number 600. And then this bylaw 890 developed guidance which better reflected the provincial guidelines and also filled in some of the blank spots of that guidance. And so one of the things that kind of emerged that I just want to chat about briefly in this presentation is that the bylaw reflects a sort of a risk tolerance approach that was articulated throughout the project. So in simple terms, it's kind of in front of you, but in simple terms, this can be understood as that if a proposal substantially increases the life of existing at-risk development or introduces new at-risk development in a designated floodplain, it must either meet floodproofing requirements or rely on qualified professional to confirm the risk is tolerable while minimizing liability to the CBRD and exposure of the community to flood hazards. So that kind of underpinned a lot of the further work. So bylaw 890 is structured around a few kind of core elements. It designates the floodplain areas through the official CBRD floodplain maps. And this is in the schedules, of course, but one of the key components of the bylaw is that it identifies the online mapping repository, so CBRD's IMAP application, as the official map associated with this bylaw. And this means that any kind of like fixes or small updates or improvements can be made ongoingly and integrated into the bylaw. So the external IMAP site shows the coastal floodplain setback line. And it's shown here, actually, sorry, this is an older photo. It's shown here in brown, but on IMAP, it will show in yellow. It's a polygon. And if the proposed development falls within that extent, within the yellow, then the project will likely be subject to floodplain specifications. The bylaw regulates construction, reconstruction, alteration, movement, and extension of building and structures, and states that no one should do any of those actions so that a building or structure contravenes the bylaw. It also establishes floodplain specifications. So specifically, there are flood construction levels or FCLs in the scheduled mapping specifically. These are transect FCLs prepared by KWL, and it also has floodplain setbacks, so the extent. It also identifies general and conditional exemptions for certain lower risk buildings, structures, and works, and establishes expectations for site-specific exemptions supported by professional reports, assurance statements, and where applicable, restrictive covenants. So the practical starting points for QPs like yourselves is really to determine whether the subject property and proposed works are within the designated floodplain mapping, identify the applicable FCLs and setback, and then determine whether the proposal can be compliant with those or whether it requires a site-specific exemption. Okay, so now I'm going to walk you through a few of the most important changes from the previous bylaw. So starting, one of the key changes, as we said, is that these flood mitigation requirements are now applied within the mapped flood hazard area. So previously under bylaw 600, the expectation was that these requirements applied within 100 meters of the coast. So quite a broad 100-meter setback. And that meant that on occasion it would include areas not actually hazardous in this way or emit areas that were hazard areas. So bylaw number 890 replaces that broad stroke 100-meter setback with an application of flood hazard mitigation requirements within the mapped flood hazard area itself. And this is probably the most significant change for applicants and for professionals such as yourself, because there's specific information now in the mapping about where floodplain requirements apply and what the setbacks and FCL standards are. Also, these sites, sorry, pardon me. It also, the use of this mapping allows property owners to use the mapped floodplain setbacks and FCL to guide development rather than always requiring a QP to complete a site-specific study. So this would mean that on coastal properties where the setback doesn't show for the entire property, bisects it, for instance, that applicants are able to build outside of that without needing to go through the process. So a site-specific study is required when the proposal doesn't meet the map floodplain setback or FCL and therefore requires a site-specific exemption. And so for QPs on the call, as you know, your role may often include confirming compliance, so whether or not it is in that applicable area. We also worked on having some clearer definitions, particularly for things that had been long-standing issues. So topics that had some ambiguity, like the question of what are goods damageable by floodwaters, storage, that kind of thing. So some of those have been improved in this bylaw. Another example would be we've refined the definition of watercourse to remove application to roadside ditches in the jurisdiction of MOTT, Ministry of Transportation and Transit. And this was kind of a chronic topic of feedback from applicants and QPs that the previous floodplain bylaw could require that habitable area developments within 100 meters of small roadside ditches had to meet floodplain specifications, so FCL and setback, and that wasn't really reflective of the level of risk. So those have been removed now and they're exempt. The incorporation of mapped floodplain setbacks and transect FCLs into the bylaw really aims to apply the regulation where the actual flood hazards exist. And so that's, the main focus. And then I want to briefly touch on here that the bylaw provides clarity and new definitions on exempt forms of development. So prepared this table here, and if anybody would like a copy of this or a copy of the slides afterwards, just let me know. But this is just a little bit of a summary. So I'm going to rip through a few of these examples. The bylaw defines entryways as up to 12 square meters and exempts these from floodplain specifications. So they're exempt up to that size limit. Also, it provides a new definition for storage building. These are a non-habitable accessory building under 20 square meters used for the storage of goods that are not damageable by floodwaters. And this would mean things like a shed for landscaping equipment or a building that holds recreation equipment storage. These were things that had recurringly been subject to floodplain requirements, and now these buildings can be constructed up to 20 square meters without needing to meet floodplain specifications. Bylaw number 890 also clarifies the distinction between renovation and reconstruction. So reconstruction is defined as the substantial rebuilding equal to or greater than 50% of the structural elements above the foundation. They must meet FCL and floodplain setback or seek a site-specific exemption. But renovations, by contrast, which fall under that 50% of structural elements, are exempt where they don't involve an addition, reconstruction, or creation of new habitable area or dwelling units. So they're able to proceed with things like kitchen renovations, new windows, stuff like that. This distinction is important in the review. QPs and designers should clearly describe really the scope of work and whether what those elements being changed are in order for us to be able to clarify whether it's a reconstruction or a renovation, and be very clear about what type of development is being is being suggested. And so it's very important to really clearly identify. So, for example, if an entryway is being proposed, it should really say that very clearly in order to be confident what the form of development is. I'm going to talk now, the thing that you are all probably most interested in, site-specific exemptions. So site-specific exemption is required where the proposed development is subject to the bylaw and can't meet applicable flood construction level or floodplain setbacks. The exemptions will be quite familiar to this audience. We've maintained the professional reliance model that is set out under the Local Government Act with the adoption of this new bylaw. And I want to note that before beginning an assessment report to support a site-specific floodplain exemption, this is just a little plug to folks in the audience that it's quite helpful to consult with CBRD planners through a pre-application meeting in order to confirm the development, the requirements around that development. And also that we have a floodplain report guide now available on the website. It's updated to reflect this new bylaw as well. So also a little plug for that. Take a look at that when you're beginning your preparations. So what we're looking for with the site-specific exemption, of course, is that the report is complete, directly responsive to the bylaw, and that it should include everything in the floodplain report guide checklist that I mentioned, as well as an flood assurance statement. And we've updated that document as well to reflect the new bylaw, and it's been reviewed as well by EGBC. So when a proposal is not consistent with the floodplain requirements, so the floodplain specifications being FCL or setback, the exemption has to be sought consistent with Section 524 of the Local Government Act. So I'm going to go through kind of three critical areas on this topic for you folks. So if a proposal does not meet the mapped flood construction level, the engineer report prepared by a qualified professional can prescribe a new FCL based on site-specific calculations. As I mentioned, the flood levels in the mapping were prepared on a transect basis, so we have an understanding that when you consider the calculations on a site-specific basis, that there will be elements that may lead to different FCLs. So the mapped FCL, when an engineer report prescribes a new FCL based on those site-specific conditions, then the mapped FCL can be waived or exempted in favor of meeting the new prescribed FCL through a site-specific exemption. I want to make a small note here. Under the provincial guidelines, habitable space additions under 25% may be exempt from meeting floodplain specifications. However, in this bylaw number 890 under the CBRD, we don't have that exemption included. Instead, we require that no habitable area be constructed, reconstructed, altered, added, or moved or extended lower than the flood construction level. And this is really in line with the CBRD's risk tolerance approach, which I outlined earlier in this presentation, that seeks to ensure any application which increases the life of existing at-risk development or introduces new at-risk development in the designated floodplain would meet flood proofing requirements. So therefore, new development can only be built below a prescribed FCL if it is in one of the exempt categories that we just outlined. Next, the floodplain setback. So if a proposal does not meet the mapped floodplain setback, the engineer report has to indicate a valid hardship to modify the setback per the provincial guidelines. And bylaw number 890 kind of just reiterates those requirements from the provincial guidelines. And it does also include some new guidance for QPs to provide rationale for the citing of the proposal. So the report should reference the mapped setback and proposed citing, and proposed citing should represent the minimum variation from the bylaw requirements based on site characteristics, existing infrastructure, and intended use. And otherwise, it should provide the rationale for the citing location. And this is section 403 in the bylaw. And it's intended to ensure that the default siting of any new development is as far from the hazard as possible. If the proposed siting is not the minimum variation, then the QP report should confirm, again, through that professional reliance, the rationale for why the siting is supportable and confirm the location is safe for the use intended and that it doesn't present any greater risk than siting it as far from the hazard as possible. So finally, there in the flood mitigation works. As you know, any exemption report must certify that the land is safe for the intended use and specify any mitigative requirements that make it so. So where structural mitigation is proposed, the report has to include that flood mitigation. So bylaw number 890 confirms that the report also has to certify any structural support and landfill used to meet FCL won't adversely impact neighboring adjacent properties or transfer the risk by increasing flood levels or directing flows. And again, this comes from the provincial guidelines, but it's now spelled out a bit more clearly in this bylaw. So as was also true, this will be a reiteration for most of you, but as was true in the previous bylaw, a condition of a site-specific exemption is for the property owner at their expense to prepare and register a Section 219 covenant in favor of the CBRD. And the expectations, the requirements then must specify the conditions that enable the land to be safely used, and that is in the engineer report, which then forms part of the covenant. Okay, we're getting towards the end of my portion here, so I'm going to do a sort of a rapid-fire synopsis of takeaways for you from the new bylaw number 890. First, once again, we're going to start with the mapping. The regulatory mapping of 2021 is now central to the bylaw itself. If the proposal meets the mapped FCL and setback, a site-specific exemption is typically not required. But if it does not, then an exemption report must clearly identify both the map standard and the floodplain specifications modifications. Next, it's also very important to confirm whether the proposed work qualifies for any exempted type of development. Second, the valid hardship is tied to the physical characteristics of the land. This is required to modify a setback. And so again, just reiterating that it's the physical characteristics and whether the development consistent with current zoning can occur under the bylaw. So economic circumstances, siting preference, design preference, things like that are not considered valid hardship. The safer intended use is just a really important part of these reports. A clear professional conclusion that the land may be used safely for the use intended, subject to identified conditions, and that those QP reports establish required or prescribed FCLs and confirm that the proposals meet it and the setback. And for setback exemptions, the report really should be showing that the siting is the minimum variation from the bylaw. So in practice, that means that applicants with buildable area outside the designated floodplain must build there unless there are physical characteristics and hardship that prevent it. So where applicants have to build within the designated floodplain, for instance, on lots that are fully within it, they should be building as far from the hazard as possible, or the QP report should provide rationale and confirm that the siting is as safe as possible. Also, just to reiterate what I just said, but that reports, because the professional reports form part of the covenant, it's really important that mitigation recommendations are written clearly enough to be implemented, including precise prescriptions on FCL setbacks, as well as the siting plans, construction conditions, maintenance obligations, things like that. And then also just wanting to once again state the flood assurance statement has been updated, so that should form part of your application. And approved by EGBC, and that the CBRD often requires flood assessment reports to be independently peer reviewed, which is always for sole practitioners. So just a flag to, it's kind of best to build this possibility into project timelines, especially for more complicated applications. Finally, then, just a reminder, complete submission is where all the report, the drawing, survey, assurance statements, citing rationale, et cetera, all align together. And something that can slow things down is sort of mischaracterizing the development type and assuming that the project either does or does not qualify for an exemption. So it's just really good to confirm with CBRD staff before going too far. And something I'd like to plug is that we have, by my understanding now, you can book those pre-application meetings through our online system. And of course, that another plug for the guide, which is available on the website to help move you through. So to close, bylaw number 890 provides a more current and precise framework for flood hazard land use management in the CBRD electoral areas. Much of the bylaw remains the same as bylaw 600, and aligns with the provincial guidelines. But there are some key updates, and we hope you feel maybe a bit more comfortable or informed about those now after this presentation. And I'm just going to close with a couple other things to make you aware of. As of quite recently, the fees and procedures bylaw was updated, and site-specific floodplain exemptions can be considered now via delegated authority. And this means that these applications do not have to wait to be presented at a monthly board meeting. And this was something that was identified early on as a constraint, and we hope that that this kind of helps the process be able to move more expeditiously. as the bylaw provides clarity and consistency, or our hope is better clarity and consistency, the expectation is that staff recommendations are going to be the same regardless of who is approving the application. But under the fees and procedures bylaw, the decisions by a delegate can always be appealed for reconsideration by the board. And the second thing I just want to highlight here is that currently qualified professionals can get access to the mapping from 2021 through a data sharing agreement. We understand, though, that full data package can be unwieldy and may take additional QP time to refine and narrow down what's needed for just a site-specific exemption. So we're working with our GIS team to develop a new data package, and that would just have the most critical layers, essentially this mimicking the IMAP or schedules of the bylaw, but at a resolution where that setback line, polygon, or the FCL can be included on a site-specific survey. And so that data will also be shared through a data sharing agreement, and we hope to have it ready in the next couple of weeks. So I just want to make a note that if you'd like to be notified about when that data product is available, just put your email in the chat and I'll follow up with you after this when I've got a data sharing agreement for you. So thanks everyone for making time today to attend, and of course for the technical role that you play in helping manage flood risk in Comox Valley and keeping our community safe. And I'm going to move now onto the next portion of the presentation. And yeah, really pleased to welcome Eric from KWL. He's going to give you an overview of the coastal flood mapping. Being an engineer himself, I'm sure you'll all be very happy to receive information from someone who more so speaks your language. So I'm going to kick it over to Eric now, and thanks to everyone for listening through there.
Okay, thanks, Monica. Going to share my screen. You should hopefully see PowerPoint slide. Okay, that's a good start. Start a slideshow. Can you see a slideshow? Excellent. And I can change slides. That's perfect. Yeah, so I'm Eric Morris. I'm a coastal engineer with Kerwood Lytle, and I'm going to go over the mapping included in the bylaw. In particular, I'm going to talk about the mapping developed by Kerwood Lytle in 2021, which is included in Schedule B of the bylaw. It covers the coastline, the Oyster River, the Lower Puntledge River, and the Courtney River. So the bylaw designates lands as floodplain using several mapping sources and geometric offsets from water bodies. It says that lands designated as floodplain are lands shown as floodplain on the regional district's floodplain maps, which are included for reference as Schedule B, C, and D in the bylaw. Schedule B, as I mentioned, developed by KWL, is one of those sources of mapping. Schedule C is mapping of the Courtney, Puntledge, and Solom rivers from 1991. And Schedule D is floodplain mapping for the Oyster River from 1984. The bylaw says where one area is mapped in Schedule B, C, and or D, the maps maintained as digital records on the CVRD online mapping tool designate the floodplain. The floodplain is also defined by land being lower than the flood construction levels specified in the bylaw, land within floodplain setbacks as specified in the bylaw, and land within any alluvial fan. So you can find the mapping using CVRD's website. They have a mapping tool called IMAP that's easy to find. It's a general mapping tool for lots of things, but there's layers related to the Flood Hazard Bylaw that can be brought up. There's a layer for alluvial fans. I think there's one alluvial fan in there that's mapped at this point. but there are other alluvial fans that QP should be looking out for. There's flood construction level mapping, and then there are the designated floodplains. And as I mentioned, PDF copies of this mapping is appended to the bylaw as well. So here's text from the bylaw related to flood construction levels. It says, following elevations are specified as flood construction levels, except where more than one flood construction level is applicable, the higher elevation shall be the flood construction level. The flood construction level for a specific property, as shown or determined by interpolation of the flood construction level shown on Schedule B, C, or D. And flood construction level should not be determined by interpolating flood levels between coastal zones on Schedule B. So interpolating FCLs is appropriate for rivers, but it's not appropriate for the coastline because the FCLs on the coast vary according to topography and wave exposure, and the coastal zone boundaries between the FCL zones were set based on those parameters. So it isn't appropriate to interpolate between them. Here's the text of the bylaw related to setbacks. It says the following distances are specified as floodplain setbacks, except that where more than one floodplain setback is applicable, the greater setback shall be the floodplain setback. And setbacks are defined where the coastal floodplain setback line is shown in Schedule B. And it shall be scaled from the map. So you need IMAP or those digital files that Monica was talking about to determine the location of the coastal setback. Now we'll look at an example of the mapping for the Little River area. It's a low-lying area along the Little River at the mouth of the river, and there's bluffs in the back shore. So this is a screen capture from IMAP, and you can see that there's the flood construction level labels. There are the coastal zone limit lines, which are the red dashed lines, and then there's the setback line. And the setback line is governed by the presence of bluffs in this area in some parts of Little River. The mapping was developed according to the provincial flood hazard area land use management guidelines using the probabilistic method. The guidelines prescribe how to calculate flood construction levels, and there's this figures from the guidelines. I won't go into detail on how the flood construction levels are calculated according to the guidelines because I'm sure this group is pretty well familiar with that. I'll just point out that the mapping is to CGVD 2013 datum. So that's important to be aware of when you're interacting with the mapping. And the setback mapping was also developed according to the Flood Hazard Area Land Use Management Guidelines, which says the building setback should be at least the greater of 15 meters from the future estimated natural boundary of the sea at the year 2100, or landward of the location where the natural ground elevation contour is equivalent to the year 2100 FCL. And then there's also provisions defined in the guidelines for handling bluff areas. They increase the setback where there are bluffs, which is defined as land with a slope steeper than 3 horizontal to 1 vertical. and where the bluff toe is less than 15 meters from the future natural boundary. And in this case, the setbacks gets increased by 3 times the height of the bluff. And this mapping was developed as a desktop exercise. There weren't any field investigations to confirm site conditions. So qualified professionals should be confirm conditions and setback requirements in bluff areas. Because, for example, because it was a desktop exercise, site-specific slope stability assessments weren't conducted. So that is my presentation on the mapping. Have I stopped sharing now?
Not quite.
Not quite. Okay.
I think you just have to press the stop sharing button.
Hit that button. There we go.
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Eric. At this point, then we've got about just under 20 minutes. If there's some questions, I saw one question in the chat that I've given a response to. But if there's other questions, please just put your hand up, and Tammy will also be monitoring the chat there. So yeah, this is a great chance to ask me, or if you want to talk to someone a bit smarter, you can ask Eric any questions about what we've chatted about today. And also, I just wanted to note that please feel free to reach out to myself or to John or one of the other CVRD folks on the line today if you have questions that might take a little bit more follow-up or that we might have to respond to after a bit more time. So yeah, reach out if there's anything there.
I believe Nick has a question right now about delegated authority.
Oh, thanks, Tammy. I see that. So Nick says, you mentioned the bylaw allows for approval from a delegated authority. Who is the delegated authority? Please confirm we can request a review by the board if we or our client aren't happy with the decision. So the delegated authority under this is the General Manager of Planning and Development. For the CVRD, that's the delegated authority. There's a process embedded into, as I mentioned, into the fees and procedures bylaw for reconsideration of a delegated authority's decision. So if the application is denied by a delegated authority, there's a process to essentially appeal that decision to the board, and then it would go to a board meeting. Hope that answers your question, Nick. I can also put a copy of that bylaw into the chat too.
That's perfect. Thank you very much.
No problem. Well, this feels like a good sign that there's not a giant outpouring of folks with immediate questions. Yeah, I just want to really thank everyone for joining us today. As I mentioned, this session did get recorded, so if you do have any interest in reviewing it, or if you'd like to send it to anyone else, if you have colleagues who work in our region who could benefit from receiving this overview as well, yeah, please reach out. And again, I think you all have my email now from the invite, but if you would like to be notified when we're going to have that updated data package available that has the high resolution versions of the IMAP layers, please just reach out to me and let me know, and then I will send you a data sharing agreement as soon as that's available. Yeah, so just send me your email and I'll get that going. Yeah, I don't see any more hands or any more questions, unless there's anybody from, oh, go ahead, Elena.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I couldn't find that little raise hand graphic anymore on Zoom, but thanks so much, everyone, for coming. I just wanted to flag that John has put a couple of additional resources in the chat for folks to have a look at. Many of you will already be familiar with them, but one is the floodplain assurance statement that John worked with EGBC to develop. So that's specific to CVRD, and that's a requirement that we need as part of your complete package. We've also created a floodplain report guide, which gives you more of the detail that Monica was just speaking to when you're pulling those applications together for your clients. I would just want to plug that pre-consultation meeting that Monica spoke to. I suggest that could save a lot of time for yourself and money, therefore, for your client if we put our heads together early in the planning project. And then certainly always, if you have questions, please do feel free to reach out early and often. Thanks, Monica.
Thanks so much, Elena. Yeah, and just reiterating, this is a fairly new bylaw for us. And so as we get more clarity, as more applications come through, and as then we also will update those resources so that you're apprised of what's happening. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. Especially thanks very much to Eric for joining us today from KWL. Yeah, have a wonderful day. I'm gonna everyone will get to leave the meeting 15 minutes early, which is how we keep people coming back next time we have a meeting. So thanks very much for joining us, everyone. I'm going to end the recording now.